Good morning, everyone. Welcome to those who have clicked in already, or a very prompt audience. I can see we're up at over 100 participants, so welcome everyone. Whilst we're just giving people a minute or two to join, if you'd like to introduce yourself, you can use the chat function. Always nice to know a bit more about who's out there. Perhaps you can give us a kind of tell us where you're at, maybe the local weather report. I know it's very changeable today, so I imagine there's a mix of sun and showers out there. Yeah, do feel free to say hello in the chat, just whilst we give people a minute or two to join. Sarah's first off the tracks there with from Bath. Welcome, Sarah. Very close to where I'm broadcasting from today, actually, in Bath. Perhaps broadcasting is a little bit grand, but you know what I mean. It's got David from Southwest Energy Hub at Exeter. So Southwest strong contingent. Got Kirsten from Brighton. Raining in Lincolnshire. Hastings, sunny and bright there. Yeah, very changeable, isn't it? Overcast in Malvern. Okay, so our furthest away so far is Joe from Northern Ireland. So that's will be the usual prize, obviously, for our furthest away participant. Though, of course, it probably doesn't really matter anymore. You can do it from, I guess you can join in from out of Mongolia. It doesn't really matter in this day and age, but still good to have people from all over. Got someone from West Yorkshire. Always sunny, says Hugh. Hugh, I'm convinced you're in Wales, and I'm not sure that's entirely true. Wonderful as it is, obviously. Okay, how are we doing? Okay, we've given people 3 minutes. I think they're everyone's sort of used to this this world these days, so I think we will try and kick off and keep ourselves to time. So let's make a start. Do you want to, Chris? Do you want to remove the slide and put us on the agenda? Perfect, thank you. That's Grace who's controlling the slides in the background. Thank you, Grace. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session with ENA, the Energy Networks Association, and Regen, which is focused really on how our energy networks, the pipes, the wires, the kind of critical energy infrastructure, and localities, local government, devolved administrations can work better together. I mean, that's the overall theme. Now, I'm Merlin Hyman, I'm Chief Executive of Regen, so I'll be kind of hosting today. This is a kind of area of Regen's been thinking about working in for probably about 10 years now. And we've worked quite a lot with the energy networks. Some of you may have come across things like distribution future energy scenarios, which we pioneered a few years ago and still work on. We've worked a lot with local government over the years, helping them with their action planning. We have a membership of local government. We wrote a paper last year on local leadership in the transition. And it comes pretty clear, I think, when you do that work, that particularly in the time of energy system transformation, in the time of a journey to net zero, then there needs to be much better communication between core energy infrastructure, as I said, the pipes and the wires, the kind of, it's been there for a long time, but it becomes critical infrastructure for the net zero journey. And local government, as we start to really get stuck into the net zero journey and we really start to think about the changes, the seismic shifts as we think about the shift to, moving the energy required to get us around largely from oil tankers through the Straits of Hormuz and into the electricity system. We think about heat pumps, the development of hydrogen, all of these shifts, all of these changes require a lot of thinking, planning, and a lot of good communication between local government and its plans and its climate emergency plans and its local action plans and energy networks. And actually, not only, I should say, about net zero plans in that point, there needs to be good communication around the kind of regular business, if you like, of local plans and planning and new developments, etc. So I think that's a core development competency that we need in a transforming energy system. So that brings us really to our agenda today, and our focus today is on a particular proposal, if you like, an emerging idea out of ENA and its networks to create a kind of whole system joint optioneering service. So to create a service that's going to help look at some of the options around particular areas of development, and look at look at how that impacts on the energy networks, and look at the best methodologies, the best ways that could happen. And we're at a kind of early formative stage, I guess, of that idea, and that's really what we'll be digging into particularly today. But no doubt, as we go through, we'll also, and particularly I'm hoping at the end, we'll be able to sort of pull back onto that slightly broader question of how this fits into the overall communication. So we're going to start today with Stuart from Cadent, who's going to talk us through the kind of service they've been thinking of, what they're thinking about trying to achieve. We're going to hear from a couple of local authorities, just to give a bit of a sense of, many of you will be very familiar with this, but to give a bit of sense of some of the journey that some local authorities are going through in thinking about the kind of net zero space and the regional energy system, and starting to think about their energy systems in their localities in a much more perhaps thorough way than they have in the past. We're then going to have Poppy, who has been leading this project from Regen to work with ENA to think about to help the ENA get some feedback and ideas and thoughts from local authorities on the kind of different ways this model that's been suggested might work. There's a very quick comfort break, just a cup of tea, I'm afraid, and then we're going into breakout groups, and that really is your main opportunity to engage. So we'll try and fit in a couple of questions as we go along, but for which you can use the chat function. It's probably the simplest way of doing it. So just put your thoughts in the chat, and we'll try and keep over those and keep an eye on those. But the breakout is where it really, we'll have smaller groups, everyone will be on screen and you can all input, and we have the technology, I think it's called Minty, a technology for you to vote, etc. in that place. So breakouts where we're really going to get your input. And then we're going to, at the end, step back out and have a panel session and lots of opportunity for you guys to feed in through the chat and think about this kind of, the slightly broader question of how we improve communication between networks, energy networks and local government. Great. Okay, so that's the agenda. Hopefully that all is reasonably clear. Just to check if there's anything on the chat that anyone is burning to say. No, you're all still introducing yourselves, so thank you for that. So I think with that introduction, hopefully that's all all pretty clear. Welcome to the 100+ participants that have joined us today. So thank you for all your interest. Clearly, I think this shows the scale of interest and recognition of the importance of much better communication between our networks and our local government. And on that note, I think that's the perfect introduction for me to Stuart Eastwood, who is the Future Gas Strategy Manager at Cadent, who's going to take us through the service that they've been thinking through. Stuart.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, to confuse everyone, first of all, my job title is transitioning. So if you're eagle-eyed, you'll spot a different job title there. So my name's Stuart Eastwood. I work for Cadent. My career history is sort of 20 years electricity and the last 10 years or so gas. So I think of myself as a whole system person, and have therefore been quite active in the whole system work that has been underway for the last couple of years within the ENA. If we could move to the first of my slides. I think as background to this, some of you will be aware there's been an open networks project being run by the ENA, set up by the electricity networks for a number of years, looking at how the commercial framework needs to evolve to meet the challenges of today in net zero. And And a couple of years ago, within that project, a decision was taken that just looking at things from an electricity perspective wasn't necessarily the right approach in some areas. So a new work stream was set up, a whole system work stream, with the intention of looking at how electricity and gas networks could work together to add value to customers and stakeholders. The first activities the group went through was to try to identify where the priority focus areas should be, and with sort of various parties on the group's experiences with working with local authorities, we were aware there felt like there were a lot of live issues. So I've summarised some of them on this slide. So there was infrastructure, energy infrastructure was becoming an increasing issue with local authorities. There was also the observation that what was really required in many cases was an energy solution, not necessarily either electricity or a gas or whatever. It was an energy solution that was required. So going down separate electricity and gas routes didn't necessarily support that. The overall planning process between gas and electricity were disconnected, and where infrastructure issues were identified, they more often than not they were identified fairly late in the process, which can create a barrier. So with those sort of observations, we felt the investment planning focus should be a key part of the whole system work stream. And that's sort of got three components. The third one is the one that we're focusing on today. So we're looking at how we can improve data flow between local authorities and networks. We're looking at how the networks can provide more information out to external stakeholders. In terms of what we're looking at today, it's how we can work better together to support local authorities with their infrastructure planning. So if we move on to the next slide. So once we identified that there was a focus area and how we could support local authorities, we came up with a sort of high level process to try to frame exactly what a new service could look like. And we've set this out, outlined this in a four-step process. The first step is to really understand and identify what the local authorities' needs may be. There may be an obvious one, like there's a local plan requirement, or looking at options for different sort of industrial, business, domestic housing developments. There may also be other constraints, such as time is one example, as well as the obvious ones around sort of cost and other local constraints that the local authority might want to feed into some sort of whole system optioneering service, which would need to be properly understood at the start of the process. Step two is sort of individual networks looking at the proposals, and if there are no issues for the networks, then you really stop there. There's no requirement to do any further work. Where the whole system piece would kick in is if there are works required on either of the gas or electricity networks, and that's when we think there's value to be gained by looking at this and trying to identify whole system solutions. So one example for that could be where if there was a constraint on the electricity network, then could you move demand elsewhere in that locality onto, say, a district heating scheme that might be off the electricity network, that could free up capacity, and in that way optimize both networks infrastructure, get an earlier provision of the new capacity, and at a lower cost. And then step four is reporting back. So we've got this high level process, and we've been deploying this on a couple of recent projects that we're working through at the moment, so real life projects, to try to understand if there is more value to be delivered through a whole system approach. But what we want to do today is with this session, is to broaden it out into a much more wider set of feedback from local authorities. So if we move on to the final one of my slides. So keep talking about adding value, and from the network's perspective, we've identified a number of areas where we think a whole system service where electricity and gas are working together to provide a range of options to a local authority could add significant value. So the first of those bullets there is sort of probably the most obvious one, is sort of lower stakeholder and network costs, and you can facilitate that even further if you can optimize the capacity across both the electricity and the gas networks. We can potentially come up with higher value solutions for customers and stakeholders, and within that, some of those solutions may not always be solutions that the gas and electricity networks can deliver themselves. So one example of that could be a local heat network, which, yes, it might impact the energy networks, but it's not something the energy networks themselves can deliver. But you could deliver if you're working in partnership with a local authority and other stakeholders. We think this approach could deliver more timely capacity. Clearly, you don't want infrastructure to be a barrier to developments, and there are also practical benefits as well. That if you can identify your infrastructure early, getting things like consenting and permissions is more straightforward, and also installing infrastructure when you've got sort of early days of a site development is more straightforward as well. We think there's potential for improved relationships between local authorities and networks if there is a clearer, consistent and joined up approach for looking at local authorities, local infrastructure plans. And that's sort of, if you've got a common, consistent approach and you're dealing with the same people on a regular basis, then the knowledge should improve and the relationships, and that should also then itself lead to more efficient decision making, and also more efficient decision making if at an early stage the local authority is presented with a range of options they might not otherwise have considered through an effective whole system process. So those are some of the ideas that the networks have had, and some of the stakeholders that are involved with the whole systems work stream. But we're very conscious that it doesn't necessarily matter what the networks think. If we want to develop a new service, which could be quite significant, and we'll go through some of the options later, we really do need to be clear that this is something that the people using that service are going to value and are going to use, and it's going to be the type of service that they would want to use going forward. So that's really the purpose of this session today, is to get your feedback, which we really need to identify how we take this piece of work forwards. So that was sort of all I wanted to say in terms of sort of the background and how we've got to this stage, and what as networks we're hoping to get from this session. I think next on the agenda, just handing over to a couple of the sort of local authorities that we've been working with, who've got some experience of sort of starting to think about whole system thinking.
Excellent. Stuart, thank you very much. Can I just ask one very quick question, just to help the people perhaps kind of scoping this in their head for the first time, if you like. What sort of scale are we talking about? Is this service aimed at, say, you've got a development area, an economic development area, maybe it's mixed development, but it's a particular kind of area? Or how much could you apply this service to your sort of your climate action plan, or your broader energy plan that you might be developing for a whole local government, or indeed a region? Do you have a kind of sweet spot for this, and how you would see it fitting into a more strategic thinking?
No, we did have a sweet spot. And when we first started off this piece of work, it was very much with the mindset that this was the sort of the local authority saying, we need to build 5,000 homes. What's the impact on the energy networks? So very fairly localized, quite large scale, but still fairly localized. So the initial thought was growing from how do we help that process with local authorities. I think in recent, as time has moved on, increasingly we're moving more towards a bigger picture type strategic developments and local area energy planning. So really we're hoping to this discussion today will help sort of flesh out some of those issues as well, and do as networks, do we need to sort of find a way of supporting both those types of exercises. But the starting point for this piece of work was that, how do we help the specific local growth plans for local authorities.
Okay, excellent. I think local area energy planning, that's the first mention. I think we're 20 minutes in, so I mentioned.
So win a prize.
Yeah, I think you do. We might get a few more mentions of that in its various incarnations. Excellent. Okay, Stuart, thank you very much. So we're bang on time to hand over to Andrew from GLA to give us a bit of a sense of how local authority might be thinking about this area.
Great, thanks very much, Merlin. I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay, so just shout out if you can't, but so I'll just get started. Great, thank you. So good morning, everyone. So my name is Andrew Mcmonegle, and I'm the planning lead of the GLA's Infrastructure Coordination Service. This is a new service established to support local authorities in London's growth areas to plan and deliver infrastructure. So today I was asked to provide an overview of my work with the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, planning infrastructure in the Isle of Dogs and South Poplar, to help sort of frame, I guess, how a whole systems optioneering service could support local authorities with future energy planning. So to just move on to the next slide, please. So to begin, I recognize that many of you work outside of London, so I thought I'd set the context firstly. The Isle of Dogs in South Poplar OA is one of London's largest opportunity areas, 30,000 new homes and 110,000 forecast new jobs due to come forward over the coming decade. And this area is home to Canary Wharf and the London Docklands, which many of you may be familiar with. It has a complex infrastructure network, and it is home to some of the densest populations in the UK, with density levels on a similar scale to Hong Kong and other cities in Asia. And demand, unfortunately, is outstripping capacity of infrastructure networks, and as such, a significant program of investment is required to support future populations in the form of utility network upgrades and also reinforcement. And as such, we're working with the local authority to develop a new suite of infrastructure strategies to inform the local plan, but also inform developer contributions and business planning of utilities as well. We've recently completed an integrated whole systems water management strategy and are now looking to energy infrastructure. Just put next slide, please. So in terms of our approach to energy planning, I thought it'd be just sort of to articulate that it's anything but business as usual, because it's no longer just a simple case of looking at demand and identifying supply and constraints analysis. So to set the context, the Mayor has set an ambitious objective for London to be carbon neutral by 2030. This means that alongside planning for future growth, there is also a requirement to achieve decarbonisation of the energy system and undertake a significant program of building retrofit and investment to accommodate new low carbon technologies. At the more strategic level, we have the London 1.5 degree plan, which covers all of London. And this plan has identified a patchwork approach as the preferred pathway to achieving decarbonisation of the energy system. And so what this means is that under this patchwork approach, what we will see across London is place-based approaches that harness local opportunities and constraints. For example, you may have some parts of London with a focus on heat networks, and other locations a focus on electric heating, for example, or potentially hydrogen in other locations as well. And essentially, this means that we need to undertake whole systems analysis potentially at 33 different local authorities rather than just in a single growth area, which adds to the complexity of the challenge under this patchwork approach. But the overarching objective of this work stream is to develop a local pathway that identifies key decision points, low regret investments, and a longer term strategy. We also want to inform planning policy and allow for coordination of investment, particularly with other utilities operating in the area, recognizing the density of the existing population. From a regulatory perspective as well, in terms of utilities, it's about providing confidence for strategic investment and also for the borough to unlock housing, reduce disruption, and achieve sustainable growth outcomes. Next slide, please. So I thought it'd be useful for me to reflect on some of the challenges that we've encountered throughout this process in undertaking this work stream. And I stress, however, that we're not done yet. So it's still a work in progress. But essentially the process has been complicated by the fact that there is uneven capacity in the local authority to engage in this process. I would argue that this kind of work is outside of their traditional remit, and we're having trouble providing the required data and developing policy positions on scenarios to explore and prioritize. Particularly at the moment, this is even more complicated in the absence of clear policy guidance from government. It's very open to interpretation as well how scenarios are explored, reliant upon different modeling approaches and levels, and also the levels of budget allocated for this kind of analysis. And I note as well that some tools don't have the flexibility to explore the issues that are important to the local authority. For example, disruption or impacts on development viability and the public realm. And this means that it makes it even more difficult for the local authority to engage in the process. There are also governance issues, which many of you will be aware of, in terms of who leads local energy planning approaches, the sponsorship and ownership of these tasks, and also the difficulty in achieving consensus. To support this process, we've engaged the Energy Systems Catapult to facilitate the process. However, recognize that this is not an option for every local authority to deploy, given the number of local authorities across the UK. So we can just, next slide, please. So I also thought I would provide some reflections on how a whole systems optioneering service could be applied to this activity that we're undertaking in the Isle of Dogs. A focus needs to be placed on providing an impartial support offer that empowers local authorities to make better decisions and also achieve consensus. I would also argue that the flexibility needs to be provided to feed in local priorities into the process so that the local authority can explore areas such as impact on bills, the impact on development viability, disruption, and also the impact on the public realm. These are the traditional areas of focus for a local authority, and it's important that the whole system service reflects them. Outputs also need to be meaningful and accessible. This would unlock better engagement and with residents, and also support that understanding at the political level so that the powers that be can understand the decisions that they need to make. Also, additional focused support on capacity building would be welcome as well, particularly in terms of providing guidance and support around areas such as data management and modeling approaches as well. So if that could be provided, we would greatly welcome that support. But also ultimately, it's about ensuring that local authorities can make best use of this potential service. So that's me, thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much, Andrew. That's kind of fascinating to hear about the density, particularly of in that area of the country. Okay, we're going to go on to our next local authority speaker, and then hopefully we'll have time for a couple of questions after that. So here now we're going to hear from Coventry and the RESO project as our kind of focus. Annie, do you want to pick up?
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me on the webinar today. My name's Annie and I work in the Climate Change and Sustainability team at Coventry City Council. So I'm just here today to talk about some of the activity that's going on in the energy space in Coventry and how collaboration just helps that thinking. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk about One Coventry. So this is our approach on how we do things in the council. So it's not on a project by project basis, but the way in which we operate, and at the heart of it, really, it's about collaboration, and energy is no different to that. It's really important not to think about energy in isolation because there's so much more wider system impacts, and without the foundations of good energy infrastructure, we can't really realise that potential. And that's why I'm really pleased that ENA and Regen are just working in this space. Next slide, please. So for Coventry City Council, a whole systems view across gas, electricity, heat and transport are really key to delivering that sustainable energy transition. So getting this right means it unlocks much wider social, economical benefits such as health, air quality, jobs, skills, and that's something as a council we're really keen to work on pushing forward on. And it's probably more significant to Coventry, particularly in an area where we have lots of manufacturing, automotive industries, and historically import most of our energy into the city. So we're really keen on finding that pathway to enable support in this area, not just for Coventry, but also our neighbouring authorities and the wider region as a whole. And if we can have that unified approach, the impact's far more reaching than just our city alone. We can strategically plan alongside other areas that border Coventry, increasing capacity ahead of need, actively targeting development areas to support that growth. And at the moment, we just don't look at the collective needs of the city, and we're just bolting on additional capacity, which just leads to more disruption than we feel is necessary. Next slide, please. So one of the projects we're working on is RESO. It's a vision to design an energy system for Coventry that will realise a lot of those benefits and aspirations for the city that we're looking for. And it's part funded by Innovate UK, and it's intended to demonstrate how a modern industrial city can support clean growth whilst reducing energy bills for the consumers, Coventry. So we've come together as this collective to harness those expertise across all these different areas, and that gives us that unprecedented access, insight and knowledge, of which the infrastructure partners such as WPD and Cadent are part of and have a really large role to play in it, whether that be local data, knowledge, shaping what our future energy scenarios for Coventry look like, the insights into the current processes and the limitations of what today's regulated world is. Next slide, please. So the RESO project's a 2-year innovation design project with a 10-year vision. So the idea is that through smart local projects, we explore the local resources of Coventry. So we realise the benefit of the different options of low technology, combine heat, power and transport, and it reduces losses overall, which means we gain the maximum efficiencies of what it can deliver for us. RESO actually stands for a regional energy system operator. So in its purest form, it's proposing a city scale, localised system with its own market and the organisational governance to support it. So as I said, we're not really trying to be confined by today's regulated world, but through drawing on different insights, we are thinking more innovatively about how we can make it work better to develop it for our particular city. And that means it means local authorities might have more local power, more control, more responsibility over those funding decisions. And it also means we're also exploring how we can finance that systems approach, reducing risk to leverage funding so we can begin to take some action and start moving in priority areas that we need to develop for the city. And finally, how we can scale it up or replicate it in other areas so more localities can benefit just like Coventry have. Now, obviously, we realise a lot of things have to align to make a project like this to come together. So, and they definitely don't happen overnight. So we absolutely welcome this work that Regen and ENA are working on to get some of those options and actions in space in today's world that we can move on and develop. Next slide, please. So some of the challenges that we are trying to overcome are just listed here. So the energy market is entering a new era. There's lots of innovation going on, and that's making the energy sector a lot more complicated and fragmented. So we find that working a lot across many different stakeholders is really time consuming. You might miss things as you're trying to build up that wider picture. RESO helps us bring all of that together, and it means that all that knowledge is in one room and we can just make more informed decisions. So funding is always challenging for councils, I'm sure you all agree, and capability and capacity. It's not just physical, it's about considering the knowledge and the skills of the people within the council as well. And then responsibilities for energy. So yes, there's a stronger focus on targets from a national level, but we still don't have a national gas decarbonisation plan. So understanding how central government influences that national landscape versus what we can do as local authorities can be really difficult to navigate through, and we don't have any statutory responsibilities, so we need to find ways to support and enforce that kind of activity. So another really big challenge is about linking everything together, from energy infrastructure, spatial planning, economic development and investment. And currently the way that we do it, feeding in our local plans into that existing process doesn't necessarily always get us the best solution for our city. Plans change, new developments happen, funding comes in and out, timings don't necessarily align. So it'd be really interesting to see how different authorities, work with their network providers and if they face similar challenges. So working together on the RESO project just helps us respond to that just a bit better and proactively influence and inform the process rather than just being at the tail end of it. Next slide, please. So just given our experience on RESO, I thought it'd be useful to just share a few insights with you. So having those integrated solutions are really key. The energy market's changing, just making sure that alignment of these different actors in this space, along with those who have essential strategic insight, like the local authorities, will result in much wider benefits. Data is also fundamental, understanding your baseline, ensuring that inputs that go into any modelling is as accurate as can be. And the information going in is only as good as the information that's going out, so you have to make sure that that's clear. Likewise, having a model that is agreed with the requirements and assumptions across all parties, so that there's no surprises when the proposals come out, so something's been excluded or not, as the case may be. And having someone to talk it through, so you can understand that feedback, learn from the process so it's not wasted time, or rework something. that would be really great. And interoperability, that's also quite important. So making sure there's alignment across all different platforms. So data talks from one system to the other, and it can be used by all different users and owners. Energy mix, so today it's gas and electricity, but there are lots of different other options like heat networks. Considering how these can be brought into the mix early would be great, and collaboration could help this evolve in a much more structured way if we were to support it proactively. So obviously, if these things were to happen, lots of considerations about licensing, legalities, commercials, and the whole governance of it all, which is quite substantial, but potentially could be a real game changer. And we have to consider how it's funded, who pays for it, you know, where do the profits go, who benefits and who loses. And obviously that central government influence about the national policies, whether it's boilers or ICE cars or the charging renewal processes, the future of hydrogen, being part of it and influencing it is, as a collective, can be really powerful. Next slide, please. So just leaving research to one side and just highlighting some of the examples of when we've really needed to collaborate with network partners, I just wanted to talk about Coventry's Gigafactory. So for those of you who don't know, we're actually home to the UK Battery Industrialisation Centre, which is a research base, and we're proposing to have a battery gigafactory in Coventry as well. So this is going to need significant power for the plant alone, not to mention all the jobs that it's going to create, and those people all need homes and a low carbon way of getting to work. So holistically planning that makes complete sense. But how to secure and agree the energy needs from this ahead of time is about getting the right people around the table to discuss those options, you know, whether it's a new upgrade, you know, building a new substation, or if it's a completely different solution. And these discussions need to be made ahead of time for something particularly on this scale, because it will take time to deliver those options and make those decisions, and they need to be done proactively rather than waiting to submit an application and just kind of hoping for the best. Next slide, please. And then another area where collaboration is really fundamental is about housing development. And I just want to give you a couple of examples here. So Coventry is built upon like a 6.6 kV line, and it's really quite constrained in many areas. And as we're trying to build new housing developments, it obviously increases that demand on the capacity. So currently, developers only really think about if they have enough capacity for the housing today, not necessarily thinking about the future where, you know, everyone might be trying to plug in their EV cars. So network upgrades is left with the individual property owners, which doesn't necessarily seem fair to us. So whilst we know that there's plans for the charging renewal process, that may or may not support it. So it'd be interesting to see how that unfolds. My second example is about where a new development may be made up of lots of different developers, and we understand this is offered on a first come first served basis. So the first two developers apply for their network, they agree their connection, all is fine. The next developer comes along and actually there's not enough capacity there, and then actually they find that they have to pay a substantial upgrade, and that then applies to the next ones as well. So we did an exercise where we modelled this scenario. I think it might have been in Kersley, and found that if actually the gas and electricity networks were applied, if the 5 developers actually applied together to both the gas and electricity network providers together, a completely different option could have been proposed and actually avoided a lot of reinforcement costs to about, I think it was like 1.6 million. So it's clear how this could work in practice and the different types of savings that we could potentially save. Next slide, please. So just to finish off on this, there's so much more that we can do in this energy space, and I think collectively we could actually achieve much more, and more importantly, need to achieve much more. We need to become a lot more resilient and reap those benefits from the green energy transition. So if you're interested in research, please reach out to me. My details are on the screen. If you want to know how local authorities can agree more local control and work alongside Ofgem and BEIS and have that joined up thinking of planning and delivery with DNOs, I'd be really interested to find out from your different local authorities. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Annie. And yeah, interesting to hear about the RESO project. It's one of, I believe, 8 detailed design projects. I know we're working on 2 of them with the GMCA, and regionally in the West Midlands, and they're starting to come out with some insights and results. So that's something for people to look out for if they want to understand more about smart local energy systems, or SLES if you want the worst possible acronym that we all apparently have to use. Great. Okay. We only have a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to just ask, see if there's anything on the chat that people are kind of particularly desperate to raise at this point. General kind of a lot of comments and about the kind of examples and the options and how upgrade costs can be a really significant issue. So do you have a perhaps start with Andrew, do you have a feeling about how a service could, would really work for local authorities? Just to give people a bit of if we're going into a breakout session, people are going to think about this service, they're going to, how would you design it? Is there a kind of key point that would really make it work for you, and particularly perhaps around that kind of scale? Is this something that you focus on a particular area, or is this something you'd want to do for, say, London as a whole?
Thanks, Merlin. I think the key message is that we want something that is impartial as well, so that it is outputting results which the borough or the local authority can have confidence in, and not being led by any particular solution. So that's probably a key objective, and having it facilitated through the ENA is probably the right approach. As mentioned, obviously across London, there's a patchwork approach proposed, and as such, this approach will have to be replicated in 33 different local authorities to formulate that patchwork. So that's sort of direction of travel that we're working in, but potentially it could be scaled up to a more sub-regional level as well, if that is sort of determined as a better option as well.
Okay, just on that impartial point, then, is there, you what would convince you? I mean, I guess there is a certain amount for energy networks. There is a certain amount of commercial interest in different types of solutions. There's no way of getting away from that, although that's carefully regulated by and controlled by Ofgem. So it's not a so it's a carefully regulated space, but still a space with some commercial interest. Does that give how do you address that?
Well, I mean, I think it has to provide the opportunity for third parties also to participate in the process too. So, particularly I think about heat network operators, giving them the space to participate in this process and not just have it solely reliant on the DNO, GDN, for example. So I think that would be a key objective if a mechanism can be provided to allow for that kind of participation. That would definitely support the process as well, because I think ultimately boroughs or local authorities, they want to see the full suite of options considered, and not just the two heavy hitters in terms of gas and electricity in the process. So that's probably a key ask on my behalf.
Excellent, that's very helpful. We're going to go to a poll in a minute, guys. So just to so you can all get your fingers ready on the buzzers. Basically about how useful you would find this service. So we're going to do that now, and then we'll go into the breakout and get into it a bit more detail, but get your kind of first thoughts for having heard from the networks and from local authorities. Very briefly then, Stuart, just from what you've heard whilst people are filling in the poll, anything you'd like to
I'd just like to pick up, I think it's a question from Hewell about sort of the hierarchy of solutions. So, which is a really interesting question, because I started typing an answer, thought it's very easy just to say it rather than to type it out. I think when you're looking at specific localities, the example of where do you put your 5,000 homes, we'd see this service that all the process we've outlined would give you a range of options. So it isn't about trying to pick a right answer. It's saying that here's the range of options, here's the pros and cons. Picking up Andrew's point around it shouldn't just be here's a gas solution, here's an electricity solution. There may also be other solutions which the local authority can direct us towards, like if there's plans or an existing heat network in that area. Although even with those, there's a good chance that they themselves would impact on electricity and gas networks. But those specific growth plans, I think you give a range of options. If you start to expand it to more strategic pieces, it then becomes a bit harder, because it needs to then fit into a bigger picture. So there are more constraints about what your options might be. So when you start looking at those bigger plans, it might we might need a different process that recognises that it needs to fit into that bigger picture.
Excellent. Okay, Stuart, you've all had a good time to have a look at the poll. Fairly self-explanatory. I imagine you're all pretty used to Zoom polls and responding to these by now. So I think we can ask Grace to just show us the results. We have live feedback, wisdom of the crowds. Okay, so we have that's a pretty positive message that there's definitely some value in this. I think perhaps the majority of people agreeing, perhaps a quarter of people strongly agreeing, which is good, but the majority of people agreeing, not strongly agreeing, perhaps suggests that we need to, there's still some fleshing out to do as exactly how it works and what it delivers, which is of course what this event is part of helping us do. Excellent. Okay, well, thank you very much all for feeding back on that. I'm now, essentially to introduce our breakout sessions, I'm now going to hand over to Poppy, who is head of cities and regions at Regen, so working a lot with local authorities and networks in this whole kind of space. And also who is leading this particular project for Regen in terms of helping ENA get some insight and feedback from all of you. Poppy.
Thank you, Merlin. So if I could get the slides back up, Grace. I'm going to quickly run you through essentially 4 models that the process that Stuart's been working on have come up with. These are sort of straw men for how this service could be delivered, and they range from a relatively business as usual approach with a sort of add-on to something that could be quite significant, like a whole new regional body. And just to emphasize, these are initial thoughts on how it might run, and we really in the breakout groups would like to capture your thoughts on whether they would work and how they might work for you as a local authority, and particularly anything you'd like to change or specify or qualify. So firstly, this side talks about the whole system review, which is a relatively business as usual sort of bolt-on process. You've got the local authority developing requirements, making requests to both the two networks we're assuming here would be gas and electricity. Then those outputs, after they've done a single network review, if significant issues or risks or costs are identified, then it would go to a whole system review conducted by a central team with sort of whole system expertise. They develop up these different options that Stuart's talking about, and then develop some feedback, options and conclusions back to the local authority. So that's option 1, business as usual, with a bit of a sort of whole system review bolt-on at the end of that. So the next slide is another relatively business as usual, but it's the lead network process, where this time the local authority will develop their requirements and objectives, and they submit only one request to a lead network who conducts the review, identifying works, and then manages the process with the second network, who would be the supporting network. They both do the review and help develop the options, but the process, including the whole system review, is led by one of the networks. And they develop those options and then send that feedback and conclusions back to the local authority. So that's one where one network sort of leads and manages the process. So the third option is called a central team coordinated service. So the local authority, again, only has to make one request, and it goes to this sort of central coordinating body who could receive, validate, and dispatch these inquiries out to the two networks. They work with the networks on this and produce this final report. But I guess to emphasize that a lot of the work, these single network reviews, the whole system network review, and the options, all of that work is still conducted within the network. So network 1 and network 2. So the coordinating service is sort of part of that process, but the heavy hitting still work, heavy data work is still done in the networks. And those feedback and conclusions then go back to the local authority. And then the final model is one which is a step further from that coordinated service. Essentially, the local authority develops their request. They send one request into something now called an integrated joint regional planning team. So this essentially is a team of whole system expertise. They're established regionally with secondees from the relevant networks. It could be the 7 networks, including Scotland and Wales, they conduct all the analysis, all the work, and the whole system review. So they're essentially, I guess, separated from the networks, although they will be using the systems and potentially secondees from the two networks to do that. And they then develop those feedback and the conclusions that go back to the local authority. So that's a very quick run through. You don't need to remember this exactly, so we're going to flash these up in a summary slide in your breakout groups. But that's the big 4 options that they're looking at. Thanks, Molly.
Excellent. That's a very clear kind of introduction. So those are basically what we're going to be focusing our discussion, the breakout sessions in. So now we're going to have a quick comfort break. So you've got 5 minutes, I'm afraid. So yeah, I'm afraid it's just a quick cup of tea rather than go off and do your emails. And then when you come back, the magic of technology, you should be being put into your breakout session, and your facilitator will pick up from there and introduce the next bit and talk you through how to log into Menti, which is the tool we're using alongside to help us gather feedback in an effective way. Enjoy your break, and we shall see you back in 5 minutes. So just 3 minutes to, if I could put it that way, to 11. Thanks all. Apologies there in our breakout to Paul, who was cut off in his prime. Don't know if any of you, the rest of you, were ripped out. Maybe your chairs were much more successful at bringing discussion to a close at the right moment. Okay. I think let's just have a quick look. I think we're all back with us. There's a request there from Grace to only on the breakout group with Kai, if you'd mind answering the last Menti question. That'd be very helpful. Obviously, we'll write up all the chat, but the numerical answers are very useful to Poppy and to the ENA as well. We're going to now go into a bit of a kind of panel chat session. So just before that, let's just see if there's any key points that people want to highlight. Poppy, is there anything you wanted to kind of bring out from?
Yeah, I mean, we had some really great discussions. I think there was a question about whether there was something in between the option 3 and 4 that might provide the right service. There was a bit of a split of opinion about whether this should be developed a little bit further before launching, or whether we should just start now, and the idea perhaps of pilots to look at that. So yeah, there was some really great sort of input and discussion, I think, in my group, and some really good questions about how it might work in the future, and how it works with local area energy plans. Obviously, is a big part of that as well. Okay,
Hayes, do you want to anything you wanted to flag up? Or?
Yeah, I mean, we had probably a fairly similar discussion. There were votes for all 4 models in the voting, although the joint regional planning model came out top. But then we had some questions about the scale of regions. So, for example, it's kind of Wales is not one region. There's 4 regions within Wales, and making sure that it is the right scale for the local authorities to interact with. Fairly strong views that this shouldn't be a paid for service, that this is something that government or networks are working towards, and that collaboration is more important than paying for a service. So the kind of model where everyone puts in some resource would seem to work towards that. And then just at the end, we just discussed the whether or not local authorities have got the right skills, and while some of them have, some of them definitely haven't, and people didn't necessarily feel able to even contribute towards the discussion from just not having the right knowledge of this area.
Excellent. Okay. I'd like to give us 20 minutes to hear from our panel. Perhaps one point that came out in our discussion, which I thought was particularly interesting, around when we were talking about costs, it might not be just if we're trying to bring together different local authorities, different parties, different people that need to collaborate, and you're trying to get them also to agree to pay a budget. It just adds another layer of complexity, and involves politicians, and might just slow the whole thing down. So it wasn't so much the absolute principle, although that was there for some people, but the kind of the complexity that it might bring in, where it was a number of different entities collaborating. Okay, let's get some views now from our panel. So let's start. We've heard Stuart. We'll come back to you in a minute, but Andy, do you want to kind of come in and just give us your reflections on, I know you weren't able to join in some of the breakouts, but just your reflections on the kind of value that this kind of service, and where we are at improving communication between networks and local authorities. And it would probably help if you just introduce where you're from.
Yeah, no, fine. Thanks, Merlin. Hi, everyone. My name's Andy Wainwright. My day job is working at National Grid ESO, the electricity system operator for GB, where I am the whole system senior manager. So I get involved in a lot of the discussions around DSO and around whole system. Obviously, for us, we sort of take a macro level. You're probably most familiar with us as an organisation through our future energy scenarios. So this is a really interesting area for me to pick more out. I'm here today in my role as chair of ENA Open Networks Workstream 4. So this is the whole energy workstream, and this work is being done under that piece of work. And I think, just speaking on behalf of the ENA, we're really keen to sort of see 2 big pieces of work: the Open Networks programme, which is looking at the development of flexibility markets, the transition to DSO, and also the Gas Goes Green programme, which is looking at how we decarbonise the gas sector, how they come together, and actually bringing gas and electricity networks together in a collaborative way is more difficult than you think. I know one of the things that came out earlier was about data, standardised data and interoperability. I saw that as a theme coming out in some of the discussions. And, there's a lot about getting common languages, talking between ourselves and understanding where we're both coming from. Initial bits of the work stream were very much focused in that direction, but I'm pleased that we've got some real momentum going with some big areas of work this year, including this work looking at different models for the way we can best sort of give local authorities the information they need. So it's been very interesting, and unfortunately, as Merlin said, I couldn't get into the debate, but it was very interesting to see the models come up on screen and walk through sort of the different options across the 4, from the light switch one through to some more radical suggestions. And at this stage for us, this is more about getting the stakeholder views. This is understanding what works for you, what you need, and then taking that back to help us at the ENA, the gas networks and the electricity networks understand what we need to do. So, please do go on the chat give us the questions, give us your thoughts, give us your observations, because all feedback we get is great feedback.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ray from Regen, who is another of our facilitator, as ever, as the most organised person in Regen, certainly, and has put some good notes into the chat. Thank you, Ray. As Andy says, if there are other points that you haven't yet articulated you want to raise, chuck them into the chat and we'll keep on looking at those. But also just invite a view from Ollie, who is the network strategy engineer at WPD, someone Regen works with closely on the distribution future energy scenarios. Ollie, how do you see this working, and what have you heard so far today that's kind of shaping your thinking?
Yeah, thank you, Merlin, and morning, everyone. Yeah, I'd just like to thank everyone for attending. First of all, it's not very often that we get to have such a wide audience of so many local authorities that we can kind of gauge their interest for different things. So it's really useful to get this level of feedback. And yeah, thank you to Regen for the running this session and allowing the feedback through Menti, so we can have some kind of quantitative feedback to assess how this session has gone. Yeah, in my role, I work for Western Power Distribution as a network strategy engineer, leading on the distribution future energy scenarios, so a more kind of a regional look at the expected growth in our license areas. And it's interesting to see how that relates to both the National Grid ESO fares, as Andy Wainwright mentioned, and how you need to make sure that when you add up everything amongst the regions in the country, it makes sense from a national perspective, but also making sure that through our activities, through strategic planning as a network, we're trying to capture the expected ambition through all of the local authorities and make sure that we capture all of the ambition that we want, that our stakeholders want regionally, but then also makes sense that when you aggregate up all of our kind of scenario forecasting activities as networks, it does make sense from a national and a coherent perspective. So I think in our session, and I think Ray's already put the answers on the breakout group, I think it was really useful, and we got some good feedback. And one thing I'd like to kind of highlight, and think that through the work that we've done in the Open Networks Whole Energy Systems work stream over the last couple of years, and trialing that 4-stage process that you've probably seen on some of the slides, is that there's definitely an opportunity in terms of how the data is collected in the first sense, so that's stage 1, and then also how the data is presented in the kind of the output report from this whole system service. It will be really useful as part of this exercise to try and come up with a standardized template of how this data is, number one, in the first instance, shared with networks as part of the service, but then also how it's provided from this whole system service back to our stakeholders in such a way that a really important point that came up is that the output of this whole system service could be, I suppose, quite a network-centric look at things, which would give you a good explanation of what the kind of the least cost in terms of connection costs solution may be, and what that would involve in terms of disruption. But there are other kind of intangibles that you need to assess through all of these kind of whole system services, such as, I suppose, the carbon impact that networks aren't necessarily best placed to comment on, and then also kind of the more wider societal benefits that networks aren't able to assess. So it's, I suppose, to sum up, and apologies for talking for so long, finding something that has a common format on both the input data and the output data is something that I'm quite keen to see this service kind of deliver on, so that we can all, as Andy says, talk in a common language, and it'll be beneficial to everyone.
I seem to manage to mute myself there after doing this for a year. I still doing it. Perhaps we all are. Okay, let's pick up on a question from Huel. A couple of points there, but Stuart, is there, and maybe Andy might have commented, doesn't this need to happen everywhere? Does it make sense that we do this in particular places, maybe those places even that could afford it, perhaps, or but if we're trying to level up, as Huel puts it, shouldn't this be a kind of coordinated approach across the country?
Yeah, no, I entirely agree, and I think we might try and develop a service that across all the energy networks. You know, it would be something that if you did roll it out, you know, you might roll it out in phases or stages, but it would be something that we'd all do consistently, whatever that new service looks like. So yeah, I would agree with that. It does need to be something that is consistent and coherent, and also as I mentioned in a few conversations earlier, that will help, that consistency will help it fit into the bigger picture as well, and enable us to scale this up and grow. So I'd absolutely agree. This has to be. Okay. This isn't something you do in a few localities. This is something that we would want to roll out everywhere.
And anything else from your breakout and what you're hearing? Anything else that particularly struck you?
I mean, a couple of things struck me, and then thinking them through, they sort of came together. So there was the observation that the need for impartial information, to have the confidence that information was impartial, so that all the credible whole system options are being put forward, which people might not necessarily have that confidence initially. If you've got an electricity network and a gas network, you might not necessarily come up with all the options. And the second point was the concerns around funding on the local authority side, and that sort of role as an intelligent client, because you need that as well. So I think those two things come together almost to highlight how early we are. The stage that the relationship is between energy networks and local authority, it's very immature. Sounds quite negative, but there are some good ones out there, but broadly we're still sort of at arm's length, and we need to sort of build those stronger relationships, build that knowledge, build that trust, and start working together to provide solutions collectively. And even this new process, it can't be a black box where a local authority says, can you tell us something, and then we go away and then come up with a dinner, here's the answer. It needs to be an iterative process. It needs to be something where you can take account of all the local issues, all the local constraints. Yes, you need to factor in the wider picture, and it needs to be consistent and coherent with that wider piece, but it's something that you develop in partnership, and that's how you build those relationships. So that's my take from this is, I think we absolutely need to do something. I'm not entirely clear what that needs to be, but we need to take that next big step to help improve those relationships and build that service on the network side and that intelligent client on the local authority side, because that's the direction of travel here. You know, it's not going to get lighter; it's only going to get more intense.
Okay. Anyone's got the answers for Stuart? Then I'm sure he'd be
please tell me. Yes, please.
Yeah. There was Stuart, probably just for yourself quickly. There's also a question about timescales. You know, not, I suppose, which is sort of what next. Taking all this feedback, when do you think something might emerge?
We've got in June, July, I think we're due to go back to the Open Network Steering Group for sort of a go no go decision on what we want to take forward, if anything at all. So I think at that stage, we'd be looking for that steering group to agree that we have something that we want to take forward, and that wouldn't be and here's the answer. It would then be the next stage of development work, which again would need to be informed by all the stakeholders, not just the network. So I think in this summer we will be making a decision on exactly what we want to take forward on this.
Okay, excellent. Andy, perhaps as not representing either a gas or electricity network, one of the questions that sort of was coming up in the chat before and during our conversation, was about, I don't know whether impartiality or, the right answer. Clearly a gas network or electricity network, or indeed a heat network, others might have different commercial interests or views or perspectives. And a local authority obviously wants some of the local authorities have decided to go net zero by, say, 2030 or something, which before hydrogen is available. So that's colouring their thinking a bit. How do we, given the absence of a sort of really clear national answer to the mix of different heating technologies of the future, how is it possible to come up with this kind of joint thing that we all get together and we all agree on, and everyone agrees is fair and impartial? Or is it inevitably just going to end up with here's two different approaches?
So it's a very inspired question, isn't it, Brad, in that one? That's a very good question. I mean, for us, as you say, we've sort of moved away from National Grid Electricity Transmission to be a separate organisation, to get rid of any perception we may be sort of favouring any particular solution. So we're very much in that space of facilitating open discussions. I think probably of more relevance to the audience today is the DNOs who through the ENA made commitment to take flexibility first. So rather than sort of look at building assets, you know, they've all signed on to a series of commitments to demonstrate they're taking a flexibility first approach and looking for non-network solutions, so procuring services from local generators or demand users or battery storage, whatever, to help reduce the cost of infrastructure investment, get zero carbon generation connected to the system more quickly, or whatever needs to happen to advance net zero in the most efficient way. And I guess the question sort of begs an answer. Is something needed in a similar space across gas and electricity, looking at the broader whole energy system piece? And that's something we can take back to the ENA and certainly sort of run up the flagpole and see if it lands. Because I think there could be merit in doing that and saying that, you know, as members, we're looking at the right solution to achieve net zero, to do it at lowest cost to the consumer, to make it work for local communities. Those are all things we should probably be considering as members of the ENA, I would have thought.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Andy. And Ollie, there's a number of questions in the chat which are about kind of scale and output and, you know, what level does this planning and service and the outputs come back to it? Is it kind of street by street level? Is it local authority level, a particular area? How, you know, it's probably quite a lot to answer in 3 minutes or 2 minutes here, but just can you give people any sense of the best, from your point of view and from the gas networks, the best scale to do this kind of planning and thinking at?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think this service is, I would say, quite scalable in the sense that it could be down to quite a granular, quite macro level, depending on the particular, let's say, connection that a customer wanted to have. But then, as long as the networks that are involved, all the networks that are involved need to be, then you could arguably scale this system up to include multiple interested stakeholders. So that's local authorities as a kind of a combined authority or a LEP sort of arrangement, whereby there's potentially multiple electricity distribution transmission networks as well as gas distribution networks. I think it may make the process a bit more, potentially a bit slower if there's a lot more parties involved, but I don't see why this service couldn't be something that is potentially scalable to, let's say, a much larger solution for a much wider region, if that is what is required for, let's say, a Scotland or a Wales, if they were looking at kind of combining together for a wider region.
Okay, sure. Just feeding into that, Hugh mentioning here, thank you, Hugh, for your questions. The whole system isn't just electricity and gas. It's, you know, what we can define it in lots of different ways, but there's land, mobility, you know, there's a lot of other decisions that feed into these, you know, a whole system thinking here. Does that, and so a concern may be that you just sort of, you know, don't think about different approaches. I don't know, let's have less EV charging because we invest loads of money in cycle paths instead. You know, we can all imagine lots of kind of different ideas. Is there a risk that we just too narrow, or how do you kind of get in that genuine whole system thinking?
Our concern, Merlin, was that the first description with the parallel presses called itself a whole system, but it wasn't. It was parallel systems.
Yeah.
And we need to take into account heat networks, but my best example from Stoke-on-Trent, they have 3,000 tons of grass cuttings a year, which a long time ago went into a hole in the ground and now goes into an AD plant and produces biogas. And you can still choose whether to use that biogas for the bin lorries, the local heat network, or for the ceramics, or for electricity. So you've got lots of interacting systems, and sometimes the energy system, because we're used to, you know, working on our own, we forget what our systems are for. They're for local places to thrive, not just for the security of our bit of the system.
That's the disembodied voice of Hugh like that. So thank you, Hugh. Very articulately put, actually, I thought. Okay, look, we're coming. Yeah, clearly we could discuss some of these issues for many happy hours. But we're coming towards an end. So just before I thank everyone, Poppy, in terms of any further input, or if people have got, go away and they reflect on this, what's the best way of
I mean, we will send around with a sort of review, so people can have a look again in the pack, and if they want to send any more comments into us, that would be great, and we'll put in a name and contact details for the ENA as well. So yes, we would encourage people, if they have further thoughts, to carry on feeding them into us and to the ENA also.
Okay, excellent. So you'll all get an email with links, etc., and follow-ups. And say, if anyone goes away and really thinks about any thoughts, please do feed them in. Should probably, also say, if for the local authorities out there, if you want to talk to Regen about this or other thoughts around this area, then Poppy is the person at Regen, our head of cities and regions, to contact. I'm sure her email will be in that email, or is on our website, or LinkedIn, or Pigeon Post, or I'm sure all forms of communication accepted. I think at this point, then, it really only remains for me to thank everyone, thank ENA for efforts and work on this and developing these ideas and bringing everyone together. So thank our speakers, Stuart, thank Andrew and Annie, to give us that perspective of what's going on in local authority. It's always really fascinating to hear some of the actual projects going on and realise just how much is going on around the country. And hopefully events like this are an opportunity for us to come together and learn from each other. And I think we'd all agree there's probably quite a lot of opportunity and perhaps need for greater opportunities to share as everyone is embarking down these kind of journeys. So thank you to Andrew and Annie. Thank you to all the Regen team for facilitating, and of course, most of all, thank to all of you for participating, spending 2 hours of your valuable time to contribute to this important discussion. I hope you found it helpful. Please do send out any further feedback, and enjoy a well-earned cup of tea and some lunch as a reward for participating. Thank you very much, everyone. Hope to see you soon.